Well, hello, good evening, and welcome to episode 19 of, I nearly said Fracking Nightmare. That's a bit premature. Fracking Nightmare will be on at 9 o'clock later this evening. But this is Humanity versus Insanity, the Crane Report. Unfortunately, I had to miss out on the Crane Report last week due to my presence at Crawberry Hill with the anti-fracking community. But I was able to put out a Fracking Nightmare, so hopefully many of you caught up with that. But there will definitely be a Fracking Nightmare at 9 o'clock tonight on ukcolumn.org/live. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm beginning to wonder where the hell I landed. Because this no longer seems like planet Earth. I mean, have we been through some kind of dimensional shift? I know there was a lot of discussion about that occurring a little under 2 years ago. But the shift perhaps doesn't necessarily seem to be taking the form that most people hoped for. But is this part of a critical unfolding agenda where each individual, where each soul in this physical, empirical, material realm actually shows their true colors? One of the great concerns for me is that as this information comes out, information that had it appeared in the mainstream media just a few years ago would have been dismissed as being from the realms of absolute rampant conspiracy. Now, it's taking on a life of its own. And that rampant conspiracy is proving to be absolute fact. As many other things that have been marginalized or demonized as conspiracy, and those who have dared to articulate on those subjects have been dismissed as rampant conspiracy theorists. Well, interestingly, a little under 3 years ago, in September of 2011, I was invited to participate in an event that was organized by the British Humanist Society, where academics were discussing the psychology of those who do not believe the official version of events. And the event was initially set up to literally ridicule, marginalize, and demonize those who did not buy in to the orthodoxy presented by the mainstream media. Well, one of the speakers, David Aronovich, actually dropped out. Unfortunately, David Aronovich has subsequently left this mortal coil. But at the time, he was regarded as the realist and had the intellect to be able to destroy those who dared to have the audacity to challenge orthodoxy. Well, having dropped out, I was invited to fill his boots, as it were, although from a different angle, to provide the counter view. So, of the other speakers, it was Professor Christopher French, Dr. Karen Douglas, and the 118 twins, Jamie Bartlett and Carl Miller of Demos. Well, during the course of that presentation, or that day, Dr. Karen Douglas actually made the observation right at the very start of her presentation, and you can find this for yourself on YouTube. She actually made the observation that she was not interested in the truth. She was only interested in finding out why it was that people actually didn't believe whatever it was that was in the mainstream media. Well, perhaps I was a little excessive in my observations, but I did state that her research was shallow. And I primarily made that observation because the sample group with which she conducted her study were ostensibly students who, in most cases, had not looked at these issues for themselves and simply either had an opinion that what they read in the mainstream media was true or not. But the vast majority, of course, just bought into it. Those that didn't hadn't done any in-depth research. So I challenged her on this and suggested that if she wanted to do some meaningful research, then she should actually contact members of the alternative community, those who had put time and effort into the research, where they were able to justify and support their hypothesis, which in most cases would be counter to that of the mainstream media. Well, funnily enough, Dr. Karen Douglas didn't actually speak to me after the event, and she has never actually spoken with me to this date. But it would seem that she has actually decided that in the interests of epistemological integrity, she should actually perhaps endeavour to justify her original hypothesis. Well, what she has subsequently discovered, and has written papers on it, and in fact a summary of the most recent paper was published in an edition of Newsweek about a month ago, and she made the observation that those who tend to dispute the orthodox version of events tend to be far better researched, tend to be more balanced in their arguments, and tend not to lose their cool when they are challenged on those beliefs. The bottom line is, of course, that none of us should be surprised, because those who are simply repeating what they have read in the mainstream media have no other facts to support their argument than those that are presented in the mainstream media. And of course, what is presented in the mainstream media is most often not actually based on fact, but simply the PR that the government wants to pump out. So I will acknowledge, Dr. Karen Douglas, that you have, over the last 2.5 years or so, made a tremendous effort to reevaluate your original hypothesis. And it's very pleasing to note that you actually acknowledge that those who have done the research do have some justification and validation for their particular point of view. And over the coming weeks and months, more and more of what was previously dismissed as conspiracy theory, which, by the way, was a term coined by Ayn Rand back in the 1960s, and it was deliberately invented to dismiss, to find language that could demonize, marginalize, and dismiss anybody who dared challenge orthodoxy. So what we're seeing in the media today is really quite remarkable. And I'm sure I'm not going to spend too much time on it this evening, but what we are seeing in the media is, at last, the unfolding sex scandals, the paedophilia scandals that the many people around the country have known to be the case, but we all know that they were being swept under a very large carpet. So just as I talk here, I'm not going to dwell on them, because I know other commentators have put a lot of time and effort into going into the detail here and analysing what's occurring. But what we are seeing is literally the unveiling of this absolutely disgusting mask that has been put over the political establishment in this country. And of course, the showbiz personalities that were being targeted were being sacrificed in the aftermath of the Jimmy Savile exposure, and will continue to be sacrificed in an attempt to try to prevent those in the political arena from being exposed. And I'm sure it won't have escaped your attention that many of these articles are written in the past tense. I mean, what is all that about? Past tense, like it all of a sudden stopped when Maggie left power? No, the reality is that this is still going on today. This is how the establishment controls people in the political arena. Those who cannot be blackmailed, those who do not have sufficient skeletons in their closet, will either have skeletons created, or they will simply never progress up the political hierarchy. Now, I'll stop at this one, because this comment in the paper here, is the Met hiding sex claim files? Well, the answer to that is an absolute resounding yes. Because there are individuals in the Met Police who have been known to myself and a number of other alternative researchers for some years. And we have known very well that investigation, particularly into systemic child abuse in children's homes, or amongst the children in children's homes, in care, in the Metropolitan Police area, were suppressed. And I quote one particular individual who was told that the report that he had submitted, based on the investigation that he'd been working on for the previous 2 years, didn't exist. And he was actually given a script to be able to tell people what he had been working on if they asked him. So we have systemic cover-up at every level of the establishment. So obviously we're also seeing the church here, and again, gasp of surprise, the Pope, 8,000 pedo priests and bishops, and those are just the ones that he knows about. There's, of course, thousands of others that haven't yet been exposed. And the reason that this article caught my attention, because this was in The Sun today, and The Sun has been somewhat remiss in actually covering events that are going on elsewhere in the world. And we're going to come back to that in just a second. But you see the big headline, well, big headline, it's page 6, I think. Pope, 8,000 pedo priests and bishop, and then tucked away in the corner, troops in as Gaza death toll hits 168. So what we are seeing here in the mainstream media is a massive distraction. It is to keep people locked in to the minutiae of what is occurring in this country, so that they don't actually look at the bigger picture. Now, there are some things that we should certainly be concerned about and not turn a blind eye to, because we are seeing a move towards not just euthanasia, but we are seeing moves in the EU to the murder, because it is murder of children who are seriously ill. Where is the humanity? That's why I wonder where it is that I've ended up, because one of the fundamental aspects of humanity is the capacity and capability for love and compassion. And where is this? Where has it gone? Maybe amongst an element of the population. Maybe it never existed. But if it did exist, it's been suppressed. And those people who have got into positions of political authority and have risen up the corporate ladder and in the civil service, they have prostituted themselves in many, many cases. In fact, they have deliberately done so in some cases to ensure their progression up the greasy pole. Well, it's a distraction still. It's one that is certainly leading to something bigger. Is the establishment, is the political system in the UK being deliberately demolished in the run-up to the handover of power to the EU? Is this going to be a similar situation to that which occurred in 2009 when the MP's expenses scandal conveniently took all discussion off of the front pages of the media regarding the amount of power and sovereignty that was going to be handed over to the EU in the coming session of the European Parliament? And of course, the EU is not democratic. In fact, it is outrageously autocratic, bureaucratic, technocratic, and totalitarian in every sense of the word. So who is driving this agenda? Well, this is the $64 million question, and I'm not suggesting that I can necessarily get to the top of the pyramid tonight. But let's have a look at what is going on and the magnitude of the manipulation, because let me tell you, if humanity doesn't wake up, doesn't get off its backside, doesn't get out from behind the keyboard within the next few weeks and months, then where we are heading doesn't bear thinking about. And the legacy that we will be leaving future generations is absolutely horrendous. What we've got going on right now in the Middle East is genocidal. We shouldn't be surprised. It's a genocidal agenda that was first mooted about 120 years ago. And it's been in full flow for the last 66 years. So what am I talking about? Well, let's take a look back, first of all. I'm going to jump about a little bit here. But let's take a look at the report from Iron Mountain, because this is a report that was published in 1967 based on a think tank that actually met at Iron Mountain in New York State in 1963. Now, we don't know the name or the identity of the individual that released this information, but some 4 years after the meeting took place, he was sufficiently disturbed to feel that he had to release as much of the information as he could possibly recall. Here's a comment from that report. Well, wars are not caused by international conflicts of interest. Proper logical sequence would make it more often accurate to say that war-making societies require and thus bring about conflicts. War-making societies require and thus bring about such conflicts. Well, the Western world is certainly very familiar with creating war. So I jumped a few slides here. There we go. Here we go. War as a general social release. This is a psycho-social function serving the same purpose for a society as do the holiday, the celebration, and the orgy for the individual. Just reflect on that statement. Look at the absurdity of that. Given the choice of war, a holiday, the celebration, or an orgy, which of those would you prefer? I'm not going to ask you to send me the answers on a postcard, but I know which one that you wouldn't go for, and that's the war. The only people who benefit from the war are those who think they are the rightful rulers of a planetary fiefdom and treat humanity literally as cattle. Not even slaves, as cattle. The report continues. War provides for the periodic, necessary readjustment of standards of social behavior, the moral climate, and for the dissipation of general boredom, one of the most consistently undervalued and unrecognized of social phenomena. Now, most people right now would probably claim that they are anything but bored because they have far too much to keep them occupied, because they're constantly online 24/7, more intent in using the iPhone or the smartphone than actually speaking to the people sitting next to them. We are seeing humanity pushed towards silicon. Because nevertheless, an effective political substitute for war requires alternate enemies, some of which might seem equally far-fetched in the context of the current war system. Bear in mind, this is 1963. It may be, for instance, that gross pollution of the environment can eventually replace the possibility of mass destruction by nuclear weapons as the principal apparent threat to the survival of the species. It continues. Poisoning of the air and of the principal sources of food and water supply is already well advanced. It constitutes a threat that can be dealt with only through social organization and political power. But from present indications, it will be a generation to a generation and a half before environmental pollution, however severe, will be sufficiently menacing on a global scale to offer a possible basis for a solution. All this written in 1963. Came into the public domain 4 years later in 67. What we're looking at here is what is presented as the green agenda. Let me tell you that the term sustainability does not mean the same to these socio-psychopaths who crafted this report as it does to the environmentalist and the green movement elsewhere in the world. In their definition, sustainability means sustaining their lifestyle, sustaining their dominion, keeping the general population in their place. And right now, there are far too many people on this planet for them to control. As Zbigniew Brzezinski stated just a few years ago, he said it is easier to kill 1 million people than it is to control them. How absurd is this? It's an insight into the mentality of the socio-psychopathic ruling elite who I struggle to even compare with the fundamentals of basic humanity. So let's have a look at what's going on elsewhere, because this did make it into the one of the papers here. Israel on the brink of full Gaza invasion. And of course, this invasion is based upon the story that 3 Israeli teenagers were kidnapped and murdered. Now, this is about as absurd as the 2006, I believe it was, incident where Israel contrived an event to give them the opportunity to invade southern Lebanon. This time, obviously, it's a continued part of the Zionist genocide of the Arab people. And there are certainly at least 2 Israeli journalists, 2 Jewish journalists, Leah Tarachansky and Shia Hiva, who have had the courage to come out and question whether this incident was actually contrived by Netanyahu and by the Israeli special forces to provide the opportunity to launch another attack on the civilian population in the West Bank. Now, Israel, of course, might have done this once or twice before. The USS Liberty, 9/11, 7/7, and possibly even Fukushima. I know that one may catch some of you by surprise, but check that one out, because there are some very, very interesting anomalies about the Fukushima event. And funnily enough, the common denominator of 9/11, 7/7 and Fukushima is an Israeli security company at the heart of the issue. Well, if anybody actually dares to doubt that there is an agenda to ethnically cleanse Palestine, then look no further than this book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine by Ilan Pappé, a Jewish historian who, funnily enough, is no longer able to live in Israel. As far as I'm aware, that was certainly the case when he was lecturing at the University of Exeter a few years ago. And this is a quote from Ilan Pappé. He said, "The ultimate intention of the Zionists is to eradicate all Arabs from Greater Israel. Anyone who believes differently is delusional." Of course, if a Gentile had said that, they would have immediately been accused of being anti-Semitic. Well, I'm sure many people have seen the video footage of the former Israeli minister, Shalomut Aloni, in an interview with Amy Goodman. And in that interview, she stated that it was a trick that the Zionist government of Israel used. If anybody dared question the Zionist government agenda in the US, they were immediately accused of anti-Semitism, and the Anti-Defamation League in the US is very, very powerful, and the full force of the ADL would be brought to bear on the individual, and their life would be made hell, and quite possibly if they owned a business, the business would be destroyed. In Europe, it's a Holocaust denier. One way or another, they shut down the criticism. But it's time that we have the courage to stand up. There are many, many good Jewish people who are standing up to the Zionist government. Neturei Karta, which is an Orthodox Jewish organization, is absolutely determined to remove the Zionist government of Israel. Neturei Karta actually believes that the state of Israel is an abomination and should never have been established in the first place, believing that the Jewish God actually wanted the diaspora to spread throughout the earth and to not have to worry about affairs of state. There are many good Jewish people who question the Zionist agenda and certainly challenge the Zionist quest for ethnic cleansing, not just of Israel, but Greater Israel. And this is Greater Israel. It is everything between the Nile and the Euphrates. Now, obviously, that's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen, in all probability, in my lifetime. But the Zionists work to a multi-generational agenda. So they are working on the basis that they will move as fast as they can to avoid bringing the rest of the world into their drama. Of course, Israel persistently and consistently ignores the UN resolutions which require them to back off from their aggressive stance towards the Palestinian population. Greater Israel is the brainchild of this man, Theodor Herzl, the father of Zionism. And as Rudolf Steiner said almost exactly 100 years ago, the Zionist is not the friend of the Jew. The Zionists hide behind the Jewish people. This is the Zionist flag, which some have suggested actually represents Greater Israel. The two blue lines at the top and the bottom representing the Nile and the Euphrates, and the Star of David representing the Zionist state of Israel between those rivers. Now, the British, of course, have a lot to answer for in terms of creating the situation for the current genocide to be brought about. And of course, many people are familiar with the Balfour Treaty. And no surprises, perhaps, as to whom it was addressed to. Dear Lord Rothschild. Might have heard that name once or twice before. And this is the very short missive that was sent to Lord Rothschild by Foreign Secretary at the time, Arthur James Balfour. And he says, I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty's government the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view will favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this objective. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in other countries. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Well, I'm going to give you a little bit more background on that, and there's a little bit of background that isn't actually part of orthodoxy. So no doubt the establishment will dismiss me as a rampant conspiracy theorist. Unfortunately, it's based on fact. But let me go back to that statement just a second, because you'll note that the second half of that second paragraph saying, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Well, that, of course, has been conveniently forgotten. But what's the origins behind this treaty? How did Lord Rothschild manage to bring sufficient pressure on the British government to force this declaration of intent to establish a state of Israel? How did it come about? Well, 1916. Let's roll the clock back a little bit. And Britain was at war with Germany. The war was in pretty much a state of stalemate. But Britain was on the brink of running out of food stocks. And the Prime Minister of the day, Lloyd George, was about to start negotiation with the German High Command, because Germany had effectively let it be known that it was prepared to cease hostilities and retreat to the borders as they were at the start of the war in 1914, almost exactly 100 years ago. Well, the Zionists came forward. The Zionists saw an opportunity, and they approached Balfour and George and said, look, here's the deal. You don't have to concede to Germany. We will help you by bringing America into the war. And in return, we want your commitment and conviction to help us establish a Zionist state. Well, up until this point, pretty much all of the media in the US had been anti-British. But the Jewish media owners hatched a plan in the US to start buying up regional papers. In fact, they didn't actually have to buy up as many as they thought, but they started to change the spin from being anti-British to anti-German. And of course, the sinking of the Lusitania was bought up, and of course, the Lusitania was a legitimate war target because it was carrying munitions, which the German High Command knew, as did the ship owners. Well, the rest, as they say, is history. American opinion was swung. The Americans came into the war, and of course, Lord Rothschild demanded that Balfour and Lloyd George fulfill their agreement to commit to the establishment of a state of Israel. Now, of course, Theodore Herzl, by the way, made the observation back in the late 19th century that to be able to achieve this state of Israel, the Jewish people would need to use the persecution of the Jewish people to get global sympathy. And of course, they've achieved that through events that occurred between 1939 and 1945. But it still took a terrorist campaign by the Zionists to force the British government to concede their mandate in the Middle East and allow the Jewish community to establish the Zionist state of Israel. Now, when it was established, what we see here is Palestine in 1947 on the left-hand side of the screen there. So we see Palestine, and you can see that basically there were a number of Jewish settlements. And in fact, Jewish people had lived side by side with the Palestinians for a long time. And in fact, there were many Jewish communities right through the Arab world. But then once the partition occurred, then we see that much of the land was turned over to Israel management. Nonetheless, Palestine, consisting of Gaza and the West Bank, and this piece here up towards the Golan Heights, but over the ensuing 70 years, look at what Israel has done. And this is what it is today. The Gaza Strip, of course, is being pushed back, pushed back, pushed back. The Egyptians have been forced to open their border to allow refugees to come over the border. The Israeli, let me correct that. The Zionist objective is to obliterate the Gaza Strip and take over all that land, just as their objective is to take over all the remaining settlements, the disparate settlements that have been created by the Jewish settlers moving into the West Bank, and these horrendous walls and barbed wire fences being put alongside the roads, limiting the access of the Arab community there. One of the ways in which they're forcing this case is by limiting the water going into the West Bank. So consequently, right now, the Jewish communities in the West Bank are consuming up to 7 times the amount of water per person that the Arab community are getting. And this is how the Zionist government is effectively forcing the remaining Palestinian population out of Israel. And if anybody thinks that they're going to stop once they've got the Arabic community out of Israel, then I refer you back to Ilan Pappé's observation, where he said that anyone who thinks that ultimately the Zionists will stop until they have ethnically cleansed Greater Israel is delusional. So what is happening right now in the media? We have the situation in the US where, although there's no discussion here in the UK, Obama is under increasing pressure, and there's potential impeachment there. And of course, the US economic situation is dire in many parts of the country. And in fact, the people of Detroit are experiencing similar situation to the people in the West Bank. And that is that the water companies are shutting down the water supplies to those people who can't afford to pay their water bills. And what we're seeing here is this genocidal agenda, and it bears no relationship whatsoever to the compassion and love of normal human beings. Where Peter Brabeck, chairman of Nestle, made that observation 9 years ago, that access to fresh water should not be regarded as a human right. These socio-psychopaths are spelling it out in words of one syllable. 6 years ago, I gave a presentation called The Project for a New American Century. And in that presentation, which is online, I stated that when we get beyond 2012, because these socio-psychopaths had a concern about the year 2012, which I've explored elsewhere, and I said that if they get beyond 2012, they will ramp up their agenda to establish their dominion. They have no need for the 6, 7, 8 billion people, whatever it is, on the planet right now. They are automating as much as possible. That's why we see people literally watching their jobs disappear. We're seeing checkout operators in supermarkets watching as their jobs disappear as the automation is introduced. Recently this week, we've seen discussions on driverless buses being tried and tested in London. Of course, we already have driverless trains in on the Docklands Light Railway. And in fact, the trains on the London Underground haven't necessarily needed a driver for some years. It's only because the unions still have some sway that there is an employee sitting in the front cab. It gives you some, perhaps, comfort for the case of emergency. So we're seeing an attack, a fundamental bio-spiritual attack on humanity. What part of it don't people get? YouTube is already starting to censor any information that the establishment don't like. Right now, if anyone makes a complaint about something that's on YouTube, YouTube are removing it. So, we have a limited window of opportunity. The alternative media is being targeted. We have ATVOD, the authority for television and video on demand here in the UK, demanding money with menaces that unless organisations or groups, communities like UK Columns submit to their regulation, they will seek recompense through the courts up to £250,000. This is demanding money with menaces to keep free speech off of the internet. The alternative media is the last bastion of free speech, and it is under horrendous attack. In the past week, we've seen Cameron cozy up with Ed Miliband and Nick Clegg and introduce draconian surveillance laws. There was already sufficient surveillance legislation in place. This has nothing to do with terrorism. This has more to do with the phenomenal rate of rising awareness amongst the alternative community. Everyone watching this tonight knows full well that you are having increasing discussions and conversations with not just your family and friends, but with random individuals who all recognize that something isn't right. The attack is from every quarter. David Cameron's determination to introduce fluoride into the water. In Ireland, there's even discussion now about introducing lithium in the water to fight the depression amongst the Irish people. We have the food being targeted. We see Owen Pattinson, the Bilderberger lapdog, pushing the GM agenda in this country. Every time he's on the wings, either in attendance or just outside the Bilderberger meeting, he's back functioning as their poster boy. And of course, we have the pharmaceutical industry. It's already, through the Codex Alimentarius agenda, managed to limit the distribution of natural health products in the EU. No natural health product in the EU can be sold now unless it is formally approved. And the vast majority of natural health product providers were small businesses who can't afford to go through the approval process, which leaves Big Pharma in a dominant position. And if you haven't seen it or heard it before, check out the phrase substantial equivalence. What this means is the product substantially equivalent to the original? This phrase is used both in medicines and in foods, and we're seeing another push to introduce GM foods in this country. We've got a vaccination agenda. We've got a geoengineering agenda. It's a multi-pronged attack on humanity. At what point does humanity say enough's enough? At what point does humanity stop arguing and focusing on those issues which divide us, which the establishment are past masters at creating? And at what point does humanity say, let's focus on the things that we agree on? Because once we nail the first one of those, then hopefully humanity will come together and humanity will regain dominion. We have the likes of Rahm Emanuel here, one of the neocons, the US neocons. You know, the US is ostensibly governed by dual passport holders. No guesses needed to work out which other country they hold the other passport for. Rahm Emanuel, a Zionist of the highest order, who has famously said, never let a good crisis go to waste. Well, let's use the same thing, because every time these socio-psychopaths create a crisis, it creates an opportunity for us to raise further awareness. You know, there is only another 10 months until the next UK elections. Those elections may well be a charade, but nonetheless, it's time to engage in a political process. Who knows what's going to happen over the next 8 months? I sense that something very, very significant may occur. If it is revolution, it absolutely has to be peaceful. And don't get lured by the gods with a small g that are being set up. Look a little bit deeper to those who bear a remarkable resemblance to an archetype, but at the same time go home to their multi-million properties in Oxfordshire and maintain multi-million dollar properties in the US. This is about humanity. Humanity has to step up to the plate. It has to take responsibility for the future, because if we don't, then we are seriously condemning future generations, not necessarily to lives of abject misery, but to a genocidal agenda. A genocidal agenda that gives those who wrongly believe themselves to be the rightful rulers of a planetary fiefdom dominion. We have to bring the socio-psychopaths to account. Next week, we're going to present an initiative which will look at trying to bring together all of the separate groups, not in any way challenge their autonomy, to leave them with their autonomy, leave them with their focus in particular issues, because this is a multi-dimensional agenda that needs a multi-dimensional response. Collectively, we have the power and we have the capacity to do it. In the famous, infamous words of George Bush, you're either with us, humanity, or you're with the socio-psychopaths. It's time to make a fundamental choice. Thank you and good night.